The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Viper. All stations, this is Overwatch. We have multiple hostile contacts moving through Grid 7 Alpha, requesting immediate air support. The voice belonged to SEAL Team 6's squad leader, and even through the static, the urgency was unmistakable. Captain Raven Ghost Blackwater sat in the pilot-ready room, her weathered flight suit hanging loose on her compact frame. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much and survived it all. The other pilots barely glanced up from their card game when the alert sounded. They knew who would be taking this call. "Looks like the taxi service is needed again," muttered Lieutenant Jake Morrison, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Hope you packed your makeup kit, Ghost. Wouldn't want to disappoint the ground pounders." Blackwater's fingers traced the small silver pendant hanging from her neck, a gift from her younger brother before his final deployment to Afghanistan. She'd worn it through 47 combat missions, and it had never failed to bring her home. The mockery from her squadron had become background noise, as predictable as the morning briefings, and as pointless as arguing with the desert wind. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that Raven Blackwater had already died once in these mountains. 3 years ago, she'd been the co-pilot on a medical evacuation flight when her aircraft took heavy fire over the Kunar province. The pilot had been killed instantly, leaving her alone with a damaged aircraft, wounded Marines in the back, and enemy fighters closing in from 3 directions. She'd landed that burning helicopter in a space no larger than a basketball court, extracted her crew and passengers under fire, and held a defensive position for 6 hours until rescue arrived. The military had quietly awarded her a Silver Star and reassigned her to a safer posting. The boys' club had never quite known what to do with a female pilot who'd seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. "Ghost, you're up," called Major Phillips from the operations center. His voice carried none of the casual dismissal of the younger pilots. Phillips had read her file, the real one, not just the sanitized version that made its way around the squadron. Blackwater stood, her boots silent on the metal flooring. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood that every motion in combat had consequences. "Copy that, sir. Mission brief. 18 enemy fighters have overrun a SEAL observation post. The team is pinned down in a valley with no escape route. Weather's turning bad, and you've got maybe a 4-minute window before the whole area becomes a no-fly zone." 4 minutes. In the aviation world, that was barely enough time to start engines and taxi to the runway. But Raven Blackwater had never been confined by what others considered possible. She walked toward her aircraft, an AH-64 Apache that had seen better days but still carried enough firepower to level a city block. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and diesel fuel that had become the perfume of her war. Behind her, she could hear Morrison placing bets on whether she'd actually engage the enemy or just provide Overwatch support. Military speak for staying safely out of range while braver souls did the real fighting. They were about to learn the difference between a pilot and a warrior. The Apache's twin engines spooled up with a distinctive whine that sent vibrations through the aircraft's frame. Blackwater ran through her pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, each switch engage a familiar friend in the pre-dawn darkness. Her weapons systems officer, Warrant Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez, slid into the front seat without a word. Tank had flown with her for 8 months and had learned to trust the quiet intensity that surrounded her before a mission. "Ghost, this is Control," came the voice over her headset. "Weather update shows incoming sandstorm, visibility dropping to near zero in approximately 6 minutes. Recommend abort and wait for conditions to improve." 6 minutes had just become 4, and the window was closing fast. Blackwater's hand instinctively moved to her brother's pendant. Danny would have gone. Danny had always gone, right up until the IED that ended his war and started her real one. "Control, Ghost, weather acknowledged. We're inbound. She lifted off before anyone could countermand the decision. The landscape below was a study in browns and grays, broken only by the occasional green of an irrigated field or the glint of morning sun off a vehicle's windshield. At 120 knots, the Apache ate up the distance to Grid 7 Alpha, but even at maximum speed, time was her enemy as much as the fighters on the ground. "Ghost, Overwatch," came the strained voice of the SEAL team leader. "We've got 18 confirmed hostiles with RPGs and heavy machine guns. They've got us surrounded on 3 sides with our backs to a cliff. We're taking heavy casualties." 18 fighters. Standard protocol called for multiple aircraft, close air support coordination, and a careful assessment of enemy capabilities. Standard protocol assumed you had time for such luxuries. Tank's voice crackled through the intercom. Visual on the target area. Multiple muzzle flashes from elevated positions. This is going to be like threading a needle in a hurricane. Below them, the valley opened up like a wound in the earth, narrow and deep with steep walls that would funnel any aircraft into a killing zone. The SEAL team's position was marked by sporadic return fire from what appeared to be an impossible defensive position, a small outcropping of rocks that provided minimal cover against an enemy with the high ground. "Tank, paint the targets. We're going in fast and low, 1 pass only." Blackwater's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made peace with death long ago. The first burst of enemy fire reached up toward them like angry red fingers, tracer rounds creating geometric patterns against the lightning sky. The Apache shuddered as rounds impacted the armored cockpit, spiderwebbing the bulletproof glass but holding. Blackwater adjusted her angle of attack, bringing the aircraft's nose down in a steep dive that would either position them perfectly for the gun run or turn them into a very expensive crater. Time slowed to that crystalline clarity that combat veterans knew well. Every detail became hyper-real. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid, the feel of the cyclic stick in her hands, the sight of muzzle flashes erupting from concealed positions as the enemy fighters tried to bring down the lone Apache. Rodriguez's fingers danced across his targeting systems, designating threats with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. Multiple targets acquired, Hellfire missiles armed and ready. But missiles would be overkill, and in a confined space with friendly forces close by, they risked causing a collapse that would bury the SEALs along with their enemies. This called for the precision of the 30 chain gun, surgical strikes that required getting close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes. The Apache's nose gun came alive with a sound like the world's largest zipper being opened at high speed. 30mm rounds walked across the ridgeline where the enemy fighters had positioned themselves, each round capable of punching through light armor and devastating anything softer. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the fighters who had been so confident in their elevated position. "Target down left ridge," Rodriguez called out. "Multiple targets down." But there were still more, and the Apache was now deep in the valley with limited maneuvering room. Enemy fire converged on their position from multiple directions, the aircraft shaking under the impact of heavy machine gun rounds. A warning light flashed red on the instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping in the primary flight control system. Blackwater felt the aircraft's response change, the controls becoming mushy and unresponsive. They were flying on borrowed time now, each second in the valley increasing the chances that they wouldn't make it out. "Ghost, this is Overwatch," the SEAL team leader's voice cut through the chaos. "You've got 2 RPG teams moving to your 6 o'clock. They're trying to bracket you." She could see them now in her mirrors, fighters with rocket-propelled grenades taking position to catch the Apache as it tried to exit the valley. It was a classic trap, and she had flown right into it. The smart play would be to abort, gain altitude, and call for backup. The smart play would keep her alive to fight another day. Instead, she banked hard left, bringing the aircraft around in a tight circle that would either clear the remaining threats or provide the enemy with a perfect shot at her damaged aircraft. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat as the Apache groaned under the stress of the maneuver. Rodriguez's targeting system locked onto the RPG teams, and the chain gun spoke again. This time, the precision was almost surgical, short, controlled bursts that eliminated the threat without risking collateral damage to the rocky outcropping where the SEALs maintained their desperate defense. "All targets down," Rodriguez shouted over the intercom. "Valley is clear." But even as the words left his mouth, Blackwater could see the sandstorm approaching from the east, a wall of brown that rose from the desert floor to the heavens themselves. They had perhaps 90 seconds before visibility dropped to zero and flying became impossible. "Overwatch, Ghost. Area is secure. Get your wounded ready for dust-off. Storm's coming in fast." Her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system and the knowledge that they were flying a damaged aircraft through increasingly hostile weather. The SEAL team worked with the efficiency born of desperation, loading their wounded onto improvised stretchers and moving toward the small clearing where a rescue helicopter might, if the pilot was skilled enough and crazy enough, attempt a landing in near-zero visibility. As the Apache limped toward home, Rodriguez turned to look at his pilot through the armored glass that separated their cockpits. In the growing darkness of the approaching storm, he could see her hands steady on the controls, her eyes fixed on the instruments that would guide them home when sight failed them. He had flown with a lot of pilots in his 12-year career, but he had never flown with anyone who could thread an aircraft through that kind of kill zone and emerge with all targets eliminated and all friendlies alive. The boys back at the ready room were about to learn something about their quiet colleague that would change everything. The sandstorm hit just as they crossed the perimeter of forward operating base Viper. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet, and the aircraft shuddered under the assault of wind-driven sand that scoured paint from metal and reduced the world to a brown nightmare of swirling particles. Landing in these conditions was considered impossible by every manual and regulation in military aviation. The margin for error was measured in inches, and a single mistake would turn the Apache into a twisted wreck of metal and flesh scattered across the landing pad. Blackwater switched to instruments only, her hands moving with the unconscious competence of someone who had learned to fly by feel as much as by sight. The aircraft descended through the storm like a ghost seeking its final rest, buffeted by winds that seemed determined to dash it against the earth. The landing skids touched down with barely a whisper, the aircraft settling onto the pad with the gentleness of a mother placing a sleeping child in its crib. Only then did Blackwater allow herself to exhale, her hands trembling slightly as she shut down the engines and watched the rotor blades slowly wind down to stillness. Ground crews emerged from the storm like figures from a fevered dream, their shapes indistinct in the swirling sand. They moved with practiced efficiency to secure the aircraft and begin assessing the damage from the mission. Bullet holes pocked the fuselage, and hydraulic fluid dripped steadily from ruptured lines, but the Apache had brought its crew home alive. Major Phillips appeared at Blackwater's side as she climbed down from the cockpit, his face grim with the weight of what he had monitored from the command center. He had watched the entire engagement on drone footage, seen the impossible flying and the precision shooting that had turned certain defeat into complete victory. 18 confirmed enemy KIA, he said quietly. 0 friendly casualties. 4 minutes from wheels up to area secure. He paused, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the storm. "I've been flying for 20 years, Captain. I've never seen anything like what you just did in that valley." Blackwater nodded, already mentally preparing for the debriefing and the inevitable questions about her decision to engage despite the weather and the tactical disadvantage. She had learned long ago that explaining her actions to people who hadn't been there was like trying to describe color to the blind. "Just doing my job, sir." The pendant around her neck caught the light for just a moment, and Phillips found himself wondering about the story behind it and the woman who wore it into battle. As they walked toward the operations center, the storm began to subside, and shafts of sunlight started to pierce the swirling sand. Behind them, the Apache sat cooling on the landing pad, its battle damage a testament to how close they had come to not coming home at all. The debriefing lasted 2 hours, with intelligence officers and tactical analysts poring over every detail of the engagement. They wanted to understand how a single aircraft had achieved what normally required an entire flight of attack helicopters. They wanted to quantify the tactics and document the procedures so that others could replicate the success. What they couldn't quantify was the intangible quality that had turned a routine close air support mission into something approaching legend. They couldn't put into a manual the way Blackwater had read the terrain and the enemy's intentions, the split-second decisions that had kept them alive when death seemed certain. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was holding court in the enlisted club, describing the mission to anyone who would listen. His account grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. He had witnessed something extraordinary, and he wanted the world to know about it. Word traveled fast in the insular world of Forward Operating Base Viper. By evening chow, every pilot, crew chief, and ground pounder had heard some version of the story. The details varied depending on the teller, but certain facts remained constant. Ghost had taken on 18 enemy fighters single-handedly and had walked away without a scratch. The reaction in the pilot-ready room was mixed. The older, more experienced aviators nodded with understanding. They had seen enough combat to recognize skill when they heard about it. The younger pilots, led by Morrison, were more skeptical. 18 confirmed kills seemed like the kind of exaggeration that grew in the telling. "Come on," Morrison said to anyone who would listen. 18 fighters, in 4 minutes. Even if she had perfect conditions and unlimited ammunition, the math doesn't work out. Tank's probably just trying to make himself look good by association. But Tank Rodriguez had 12 years of combat experience and a reputation for understatement rather than exaggeration. When he looked Morrison in the eye and said, "I was there, and I'm telling you exactly what happened," the skepticism began to crack around the edges. The real believers were the SEALs who had been extracted from Grid 7 Alpha. They had felt the ground shake under the impact of 30 rounds, had seen the enemy positions disappear in clouds of dust and debris. They knew the difference between close air support and what they had witnessed that morning. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the SEAL team leader, sought out Blackwater after the debriefing. He found her in the maintenance hangar, running her hands along the bullet holes in her aircraft's fuselage, with the tenderness of someone examining wounds on a beloved friend. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that had to be earned through shared danger, "I wanted to thank you, my boys and I. We weren't coming home from that valley, not without what you did." Blackwater looked up from her inspection of the damage, meeting his eyes with a directness that was uncommon among the career officers he usually dealt with. "Your team did good work holding that position. Couldn't have done anything without you keeping them busy." It was a deflection, the kind of self-effacement that Williams had seen in other warriors who were uncomfortable with praise. But there was something else in her manner, a weight that spoke of losses that couldn't be measured in enemy casualties or mission reports. "If you don't mind me asking, ma'am, what's your story? I mean, I've worked with a lot of pilots and what you did out there. That wasn't standard operating procedure." For a moment, Blackwater was quiet, her fingers still tracing the path of a bullet that had come within inches of penetrating the cockpit. When she spoke, her voice carried the echo of old pain. "Had a brother, Marine infantry. He never made it home from his last deployment." She touched the pendant at her throat, and Williams understood that this conversation was about more than just one successful mission. The story began to take on new dimensions as it spread through the base. This wasn't just about exceptional flying or tactical brilliance. It was about someone carrying forward the legacy of a fallen warrior, making sure that no one else would be left behind if she could prevent it. 3 days later, the official mission report landed on the desk of Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base commander. The document was clinical in its language, full of military terminology and precise timestamps that reduced 4 minutes of terror and triumph to a series of data points. But between the lines, Mitchell could read the real story. She had been flying combat missions when Blackwater was still in middle school, and she understood what it took to achieve this kind of tactical success against overwhelming odds. The numbers were staggering: 18 enemy fighters eliminated, 0 friendly casualties, mission completed in impossible weather conditions with a damaged aircraft. By any reasonable standard, it was the kind of performance that deserved recognition at the highest levels. What gave Mitchell pause was the potential for controversy. The military establishment was still struggling with the integration of women in combat roles, and a story like this could either advance the cause or create a backlash that would set progress back by years. A female pilot single-handedly eliminating 18 enemy fighters would make headlines, but not all attention was good attention. There would be questions about whether the story was exaggerated, whether credit was being stolen from male colleagues, whether this was part of some feminist agenda to promote women in the military. Mitchell had fought those battles herself, rising through the ranks at a time when a woman in a leadership position was seen as either a novelty or a threat. She understood the delicate balance required to advance worthy personnel without triggering the defensive reactions of those who felt threatened by change. In the end, she made a decision that would shape the rest of Blackwater's career. Instead of pushing for immediate recognition, she quietly documented the mission and filed it in a way that would protect both the pilot and the larger cause she represented. The Silver Star recommendation was written but not submitted. The story was contained within military channels, shared among those who needed to know, but kept from the media attention that could turn a genuine hero into a political football. It was a calculated decision, and like all such decisions, it carried a cost. Raven Blackwater would continue to be underestimated, continue to be seen as just another pilot by those who hadn't been there. But she would also continue to fly, continue to bring her unique combination of skill and determination to bear against America's enemies. The real recognition would come later, Mitchell told herself. When the time was right, when the political climate was more favorable, when the story could be told without being overshadowed by debates about gender and military policy. But heroes, Mitchell knew, were often made in the shadows, their greatest victories known only to those whose lives they had saved and whose battles they had fought. Sometimes the greatest honor was the absence of honor, the knowledge that the mission was more important than the recognition. 6 months after Grid 7 Alpha, Blackwater was flying her 63rd combat mission when she received an unusual radio call. A unit was trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from support and facing annihilation unless someone could reach them within the hour. The location was deep in enemy territory, beyond the range of most aircraft, and in an area known for its sophisticated air defense systems. Previous rescue attempts had been turned back by heavy surface-to-air missile fire, and the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ghost Control, we need a volunteer for a high-risk extraction mission. No one would blame you for passing on this one. Blackwater looked out at the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, thinking about the men and women who were waiting for help that might never come. She thought about her brother Danny, who had volunteered for every dangerous mission until the one that finally killed him. Control, Ghost, send me the coordinates, I'm inbound. As her Apache lifted off into the gathering dusk, other pilots watched from the ready room with expressions that had evolved over the months since Grid 7 Alpha. The mockery had been replaced by something approaching awe, the dismissive comments by respectful silence. Morrison, who had been the most vocal skeptic, found himself hoping that the quiet pilot would make it home safely. He had heard enough stories by now, had seen enough evidence, to understand that something extraordinary was happening in their midst. The mission that night would become another legend, another impossible victory against overwhelming odds. But this time, the story would spread beyond the confines of Forward Operating Base Viper, carried by the men and women whose lives had been saved by a pilot they now called simply the Ghost. In the years that would follow, military historians would study her tactics, aviation schools would analyze her techniques, and a new generation of pilots would be inspired by her example. The underestimated female pilot had become something more, a symbol of what was possible when skill met determination and courage refused to accept the word impossible. But on that night, as her aircraft disappeared into the darkness beyond the perimeter lights, she was simply a warrior doing what warriors do, ensuring that no one gets left behind, regardless of the cost to herself. The legend of Ghost would outlive the woman who created it, inspiring others to push beyond the boundaries of what others believed possible. In a profession where margins for error were measured in milliseconds and inches, she had redefined what it meant to be exceptional. And in the end, that would be her greatest victory of all. Not the 18 enemy fighters eliminated in 4 minutes, but the countless future warriors who would look to the sky and remember that sometimes, against all odds, heroes really do fly. The aircraft faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of engines growing fainter until even that was swallowed by the desert wind. Behind her, the base continued its nightly routine, but something had changed in the way people looked at the sky. They knew now that somewhere out there, Ghost was flying, and as long as she was in the air, no mission was truly impossible.